I began my career expecting that I would be an archaeologist, and I was quite interested in excavation and interested in things and the kind of the physicality of artifacts and what you can learn about the way people thought, the immaterial, from the objects themselves. So you'll see in my talk today, I will spend some time on some objects which I think should be interesting to you, whichever hat you happen to have on. Quite right, I took a turn from that original passion, but it wasn't my own choice. I had applied to go to graduate school and get a degree in archaeology, and I was rejected. But instead, I was accepted into a business program, and I thought, well, why not? You know, this could be fun. But I think that is why I stayed interested throughout my career in trying to link up what I was learning about the financial markets, the broader economy, to what I was really deeply curious about, which is the evolution of human thought about value and things like where did money come from. And so throughout my education in finance, and I've been trained as an empiricist in financial economics, but throughout my education somebody would say, well, here's a theorem about option pricing. And my question would be, boy, they're just giving me this theorem. Where did it come from? Who had this idea? What was the mechanism by which they came to this? And so that's been an easy thing to use as a method for investigating modern financial instruments and markets to try and understand where they might have come from, or not just the genealogy, but the underlying sets of principles that would lead to the invention of something like the financial systems and methods that we have today. And then looking at them in a historical perspective, again, not so much from a genealogical perspective, because I think that puts blinders on our analysis of financial instruments. But as I'm going to argue today, I think that a deconstructing approach to finance might be very useful. And for those of you that have a career in focus on antiquity, the issue of primitivism, which is you know, the constant disputes over 30 years about projecting our modern institutions onto the past. I think this is a way around that, or at least a modest way of avoiding some of the pitfalls that those disputes seem to lead to. So hence the title of the talk, Deconstructing Finance. Oh, by the way, the two books that David mentioned, one of them was a result of going and asking people that really knew their subject matter to contribute chapters. And then the second one, which is a book that I published this spring, is written by somebody who may not be a master of any of those particular topics, but it really is a sort of a digestion of my thinking about finance and world history. And it's written particularly for a general audience, because people, for the most part, when you say finance, they get upset, worried, it causes a lot of stress, and then so this is a book that I think is written for people that are comfortable thinking about history and have a broader context, humanities and arts kind of context for looking at things. So this puts finance into the context of a broader cultural process of development. I'll talk more about some of the themes in the book in a moment. Okay, so I mentioned this idea of deconstruction. All that really is to ask you to ignore the institutional features that we think of when we think of finance. For example, don't think about a bank, because that's a name given to a cluster of functions, which even today, we're not sure what those functions are really supposed to be. So we have shadow banks because the term bank doesn't quite fit what the classical definition of a bank is. So think about the functions that are being, that these financial operations perform. And I'll describe those in much more detail. I'll boil down a few of them, which I hope will be useful to you. One of the reasons for taking this approach, this focus on function, is to try and at least erase some of the cultural meanings that have grown onto our personal experiences about finance. The thrust of my argument in the book is that finance is a technology. It's a tool, and you can use a tool to do good things, and you could use a tool to do bad things. But it's a fairly complex technology that's developed. Sometimes it's disappeared and been redeveloped. But the important thing is who's using the tool and how they're using it, which determines whether it leads to good social outcomes or bad social outcomes. The goal here is to give you some interpretive methods for historical research, and also for economic research provide some broader cultural frameworks that hopefully are useful. So here's a picture of this, this book. It took 25 years to write, and it was much longer, and then I had to cut pieces out of it because even now I would recommend, if you're going to read the book, I would recommend Kindle, because once you see it's kind of big like this, it kind of scares people, and many people have told me, yeah, they said, I bought the book and I'm going to read it. So that scares me when they say that. And so as I said, finance is a technology, and I'm going to describe at least 4 things that I think are crucial to understanding the technology. The first argument that I make is that finance is a technology of time. And it's a way to move value back and forth through time. So the simplest explanation of that is a loan. So I ask you for some money, and I say, I'll pay you back in the future. And then you give me some money now, and you expect to get something in the future. So that, if you don't have the dimension of time, or actually a dimension of space, which is equivalent to time because you can't move things instantaneously, if you don't have the dimension of time, you really don't have finance. So that would be a crucial way of differentiating some phenomena which seems like it's economic, but it may or may not be finance. If there's a time dimension, it's likely to be finance. If there's no time dimension, it probably isn't. The second principle derives immediately from the first, which is as soon as you have a technology that moves things through time, moves value through time, it's not a time machine. We can't, with few exceptions, we can't put something, we can't move something with certainty into the future. But when you have time, you have uncertainty. You have this veil of uncertainty about what the future is going to bring. And that uncertainty, we can call it entropy, if you want to get physical about it. The tendency for systems to lead to uncertain outcomes, or to outcomes of energy in a lower state. What a lot of financial technology, at least in my experience, focuses on is risk. And there are many ways of sharing risk, choosing to take certain kinds of risks, insuring people against risk, but it's really and I'll give you some more examples as we go forward. Once you have a technology that focuses on time, then you have to deal with the uncertainty about the future. And so the architecture of finance in large part relates to this risk. I've also put in the term enterprise here because a lot of people think about finance as corporate capitalism and the corporation as this fundamental unit of enterprise that we have to deal with today. If you could suspend that notion of trying to put a label on enterprises that are designed to create, designed to focus capital in the pursuit of some kind of productive enterprise, then you can look at this function as something that could be taken by a government, by a partnership, by a more complex organization, by a family. Enterprises don't have to be defined in terms of the institutional structures we have now, but nevertheless, enterprises are I would argue, fundamental to the development of complex society. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about liquidity, because liquidity is this interesting thing. If finance has this dimension of time to it, liquidity is in its perfect sense instantaneous. Something that's perfectly liquid in a market means you could sell it immediately. And we never get to something that's perfectly liquid, but we move towards this concept of the ability to immediately transact and exchange value through time. And I think that that function helps us think about markets of all sorts, not just capital markets, but also the value to humans of being able to exchange things without a lot of friction. One more argument in this book, which is an argument that I may not be able to back up entirely empirically, but it's a guiding theme throughout the book, is that I claim that these financial tools are fundamental tools of complex societies. And so that as societies came to deal with the sophisticated problems of let's say, urbanism, specialization, management of illness and old age, and so forth. These are the tools that they used for a number of the things that we come to take as fundamental things that society does. Markets, redistribution, and so forth. And there may not be one or two or three specific ways that are best, and some of the book is about how China developed completely different kinds of financial tools than Europe. But nevertheless, when you find complex societies, a test I think that's a useful one is to ask, how do they deal with problems that require value exchange through time? How do they deal with risks of all sorts and enterprises and liquidity? So those are kind of the financial tools you can take to the culture that you may be studying. I have my knowledge, like everybody's knowledge about the ancient world, is spotty. So you could ask me, what do you know about how the Peruvians dealt with that? I might have no idea. My personal experience in archaeological work has been in the ancient Near East, in Syria, as David mentioned, but also in South Texas and also in the Arctic. So very different kinds of places, and yet the same kind of questions that you would ask in one, you would also ask in the other. Okay, I mentioned time as the first first aspect of the technology of finance. And I've already kind of told you, using the example of a loan, how that works. You put the money in today, and then you get more money in the future because the more money is a result of an interest rate being charged. You know, if I didn't get some return in some way, either a big pat on the back and a thank you from my brother for lending him money, or some interest rate that I could charge that would compensate me for foregoing immediate consumption, which most people have a temptation to do, then you know, it's clear that you're negotiating a process, an exchange of value through time. Now, what does that require? You can't just imagine that you're going to move some money through time. It has to do with typically an agreement between different people, and that requires contracting, loan agreements, then enforcement mechanisms, then a legal structure. And so when you begin to think about what you need to actually create a contract that moves money via a loan through time, you can see very quickly it grows to requiring a social matrix in order to allow that to happen. And in the world of finance, we deal with this, we explore these issues quite a bit, particularly when it comes to dealing with implicit versus explicit contracts, dealing with reputation as a way of substituting for a legal ability to defend a legal claim to repayment in the future. Even if you can write it down, which the first loans were written down on clay tablets, you still need a matrix, a social matrix to make sure that you get what you're owed. I'm also going to make a claim which strikes some people as strange, but I'm going to make a claim that money is a financial tool. We sort of think about money as something that we can spend immediately, so why is there a dimension of time? A coin, when a coin is cast out of metal, it was intended to hold value through time. Money is a store of value, and it's a store through time of value, and the durability is an important feature of that. So having a coin is like giving your future self some value that they can spend, and also it separates you know, if you're a merchant, or if you're a farmer, it separates the decision to sell something from the decision to purchase something. Whereas if you just had to exchange your grain for pottery, if you're a farmer, you'd have to do that at once. If you can sell your grain for money, keep the money until you see another opportunity, it opens up a vast range of choice that you didn't have before. So we think about it just as an inconvenience. You know, exchange economy is difficult, but think about it more as once you have the money in your hand from your sale, you can choose an optimal course of purchasing something in the future, or for that matter, investing in something. And that freeing up of human choice is something that is quite a powerful tool, I would argue. Okay, I said I would look at some, I'd show you some documents and objects. So this is an object that Yale University purchased. It is a bond from the Netherlands from 1648. And it's a bond used to repair one particular part of the River Lek, a dike on the River Lek. It's called Lekdijk boven Dams. And you can still see the place where this river, the dike, was repaired. But this thing, we purchased it for Yale because it's a perpetuity, which means it's going to keep paying interest forever. And so every once in a while we have to take it over to Holland and collect some interest. But you think about finance and time. This is finance and the infinite. It's a perpetual claim. Now eventually, you know, Holland will not be there anymore and it'll get flooded and the dike, you know, the company that pays us the money might disappear. But the notion that you could create something, imagine something that would be forever, and then also do the arithmetic behind how much that should be worth is something that is remarkable, and that's a kind of exciting thing about this particular document. Also in finance, when we teach our students about perpetuities, which are quite easy to value, we show them this now because they always say, if there's a perpetuity, like, where is it? And we say, well, we have one. Okay, so here's another document. And this document is the oldest known document that uses compound interest. So interest gained on interest. It's a Sumerian document, and probably something like 2600 BCE, not exactly sure. But it's a document related to a historical event, which is an event of two city-states were warring with each other. One of them took a strip of land that was a fertile piece of land in between the two, and then some 80 years later, it was retaken. When it was retaken, the cities were Umma and Lagash. When it was retaken, the conqueror says, not only do we get our land back, you owe us all the back interest. You owe us for all of the grain that we didn't have, plus we're going to compound that at, I don't know, 25%, I think it is. Could have been 33 1/3%. And so you can imagine the calculation. Actually, you don't even have to imagine it. I don't have a pointer, but see the three little holes at the bottom? Those holes are really big compared to all of the other Sumerian writing, and they've got little holes inside of them. That's what was needed to write a very big number, which happens to be as big, as much grain as the United States produces in at least a year. Okay, so it was, again, like that other instrument, which imagined the infinite. This tool, which came out of financial claims that mathematically the Sumerians were able to calculate, leads them to imagine something that's on beyond human experience in terms of scale. I didn't know this was at Yale, even though I should have known. And when I first heard about this, I was looking in the articles about this event, and I saw that it was at Yale, and I ran out of my office down to the library and said, is this here? And the woman that was the curator says, well, yes, it's here. She said, well, where is it? She goes, it's right in that case right there. It's about this big. And she goes, you want to hold it? I said, no. Okay, next, another document. This is a document from China, and it's a piece of paper money. And you know, as one of the things that's interesting about this is that the Chinese invented paper money. It was invented in a private context, but it became, it very quickly was taken over after a financial crisis by the government, the printing of paper money. Copper plate engraving was invented to print this money. This is from 1421, but paper money had been printed in China from about 1000 to 1100, somewhere in there. Copper plate engraving was necessary to print lots and lots and lots of pieces of money without any kind of degradation in the quality of the printing. Before that, China had been printing with woodblock, but the wood wears down very quickly. So you can see from this that there is an enormous amount of scroll work. You think, well, it's very decorative. Not at all. All of that decorative stuff is there as a way to prevent counterfeiting. And the whole evolution of money is the evolution of complex ways of designing paper so that it can't be counterfeited easily. And it starts with the beautiful floral design, and then the writing on it actually says, anybody caught counterfeiting this is going to be killed. Anybody that turns that counterfeiter in will get a reward. So it's a technology, it's a tool for maintaining this value through time and not letting the value be diluted by duplication. But if you think about it, I mean, this object, once you start to study the different features of it, and I could spend a whole hour just on this, you learn an enormous amount about what makes a tool, a financial tool work, and what could lead to its failure. I will say one thing, one of the greatest failures of paper money was in 1720 when John Law, a brilliant banker, thought he had rescued France by making all the money paper. And those paper certificates by John Law are the simplest things you will ever see and very easily copied. And so it's quite obvious that they had been counterfeited widely, and that led to some of the that wasn't responsible for the entirety of the crash, but certainly must have been responsible for some of it. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to risk. I mentioned this connection to entropy before, and the notion that entropy is locally reversible, which is really about how you make things that are sort of locally complex, even though the world is just slowly degrading. And so complex organizations like what I would call civilization or advanced urban society, those are things that seem to be anti-entropic. And I would argue that the financial planning is an important dimension to that. And the planning is a creation of an architecture about risk. Some part of the book gets into how that risk architecture required mathematical advances, like the invention of probability theory, and Jacob Bernoulli and Leibniz and Laplace and so forth, which happened in Europe but didn't happen in China because China had a different approach to solving problems. I would say mostly bureaucratic as opposed to market-based. I will say that there are two things that I'd like to just mention briefly. Options are a technology for risk, for pricing risk, for parsing risk, for sharing risk, for offering risk. Lotteries and gambles are a way to take more risk than would be sort of economically rational, but insurance is a way of laying off some risk. The example from the ancient world that I look at in the book is an example of a contract that, really the only contract that exists for a sea voyage in ancient Athens, classical Athens. And so that's why I put this picture up. The contract itself, which I wanted to show you, but it would take a long time to go through, is a loan to some merchants to go from Athens to the Black Sea to buy some grain and bring it back and sell it. And of course, what happens is they abscond with the money. They use their collateral to get some loan from somebody else. They do all sorts of bad things. Okay, but the reason we know about this is that there was a trial in Athens that focused, that was all about this dispute about this loan. And in there, the lawyer says, read out the contract. And so we have the contract that says, for example, how the interest rate, what interest rate was being charged, how that interest rate differed depending upon whether they left in the wintertime or not, what the collateral terms were, and so forth. What you learn from just one contract is that Athens depended crucially on its access to grain through voyages that were financed privately and contracted through fairly sophisticated means with intermediaries, which some people would call bankers, and had a legal system that used people that were extraordinarily financially literate that could understand the arguments. So, one last point. What's the big risk? It's the risk of sinking, the boat sinking. So the Athenians were really good at trying to at assessing the probabilities of boats sinking, depending on what time of year the voyages were made. Okay, now another thing that rarely comes up when people think about finance, because they sort of think about it as, well, the government takes care of this, is the whole Social Security apparatus that we have. And I've shown two people here, Marquis de Condorcet, who's a French mathematician that was killed in the Reign of Terror, who I think has invented the term progressive, was a very optimistic person that believed that you could create a financial structure that would allow people to save money, and then the money would grow and could be used to support people in their old age. The other one is Thomas Malthus, who said that Condorcet was all wrong and stupid. Thomas Malthus believed that if you told people that you could solve their problems of insecurity in the future, well, they'd just have more babies, and then you'd be right back in the same boat that you started with. So what's the point of having a social security system? That fundamental problem that I've just described the two different sides of in very quick terms is one of the most important problems that humanity has to deal with. How do we deal with the uncertainties of life, and how do we deal with human capital reaching a peak at one point in age and then declining? How do we, as a society, keep people, take care of people? And so part of the book is focusing on that issue, as you might guess, my belief is that some form of financial social security system is feasible and something that financiers ought to be working on much more diligently than they are now. Okay, so enterprise. The enterprise that I am going to talk about, over on the right-hand side, you can see that I listed a range of different enterprises that fit the description of an aggregation of resources for future productive purpose. Future productive purpose, that's what makes it finance. Aggregation of resources, I could say the amassment of capital, but capital is a very loaded word. So resources could be getting a lot of people together. Resources could be getting some cash money together. But that notion that you have to focus some value in time and space in order to do something you couldn't do before, like build a cathedral, for example, that is the that's the principle that I'm interested in talking about enterprise. And once you have this problem of how do I focus a lot of capital, a lot of value in one time and place, the problem is, where does it come from? Do you get it if you have a government like China, which tended to save rather than to borrow? Sometimes the Chinese government through time would focus the capital. If you have rather lean governments like appeared throughout the history of Western Europe, which typically were borrowing money rather than lending money, then you had to get the capital from private sources. And so capital markets that involved investors required ways to believe that their capital that they invested, they would get a future return from it. I call those sort of rules of the game. It's also called corporate finance. And we teach our students about the principles of corporate finance. But one of the things I've been privileged to be able to do is to work on one particular example of the development of the rules of the game for what was called a company, has many interesting features like modern corporations, but also many interesting features that connect it to the way that medieval cities were governed by committee and ruled. Here's a picture of the city of Toulouse from the Nuremberg Chronicles, so 1400s. And I've drawn a red circle to a spot on the river, which is a mill. It's a place called the Bazacle. It was called the Bazacle Company, Compagnie du Bazacle. And this enterprise was created in order to mill grain. And it started out as boats floating in the water, but then they figured they could build brick structures that were much more efficient. This and another company in Toulouse became a place where grain was brought from great distances in order to be milled. And of course, milling grain is a fundamental function. You have to have it in order to feed people. And Toulouse was for many years a great grain center. So this was part of the economy of the region. And we know exactly when this enterprise began. In 1371, a dozen different smaller milling companies decided to merge together, and they exchanged their shares for shares in one larger enterprise. And they said, look, in order for us to feel comfortable about doing that, we have to have some rules, like there will be a group of directors who will oversee this business. There will be some accounting processes that we will see every year, how much the grain was milled and how much money was taken in. So they set up a structure. And of course, the structure changed. A bunch of rules evolved from that 14th century structure. But those rules evolved in order to make the company exist from inception up until the 1940s, when it was privatized by France. But also now it's been, it was made. It was made a public enterprise by the government of France. So France took it in and turned it into, it was an electrical company by that time. But then they've also spun it off. So long story short, the company still exists. And we've collected prices from the old books from the company, and we've collected dividends from the old books from the company. And we can look at the relationship between the prices and the dividends and see how people must have thought about what the value of their investment in the company should bring them as fair compensation. And I'm running a little bit long on time here. I will just say the blue line are the dividends, and those are on the left axis, and the red line are the prices. And what you see is the prices and the dividends move quite logically together, as you would expect. When something is yielding more in terms of dividend income, the price should be higher. And the return over the very long term was about 5%. So that was the yield. And there, if you visit Toulouse, you should go see this building, because even though the modern structure on top is 19th century, as you go down into the foundations, they're shaped very much like the windows in this building. Some of the foundations have a Gothic arch to them, so it's quite an ancient part. I'll just say, I don't want to miss mentioning liquidity, because as I said before, I think it's this complementary feature of finance, and in finance, we're always wondering, like, what is liquidity? How do we define it? What does it mean? And there are models for trading, but I think about it as this orthogonal thing to the time dimension. I've already talked about the role that money plays, but the role that when people began to want liquidity, what emerged was a system of markets and prices which actually revealed a lot of information that people didn't have before. We'll say the first true financial market, I don't know whether it's disputable or not, but here's Venice and here's the Rialto square. And in Venice, the Venetian government had created a debt which they could never pay off, so they made it into a perpetuity, which it became a bond. But it was as a result of a catastrophe rather than a forward-thinking plan. But to make people happy about owning these things, which they forced them to buy, like taxes, they said, you know what, it's okay, you can trade them amongst yourselves. And actually people liked that idea, because you could buy a bunch and use them. Like if I wanted to make sure that my daughter would have an income after I passed away, I could buy a bunch of these bonds, and then the government would pay her the money. And so this is the square where you would trade your debt. You'd trade your Venetian government bonds. And actually, on the far side there, where the orange building is, that's where the government offices were. That you would actually, when you trade it, all you do is have the name changed from your account to somebody else's account. You could do all the trading actually, and the accountants did all of the work. Okay, that orange building, I believe, I haven't seen it in the last few months, but if anybody's been there, I think it's been turned into a luxury mall, selling handbags from Prada and things like that. The Fondaco de Tedeschi, I think. Okay, I'm going to wind things up because I'd like to hear some of the questions that you have. I think you have a flavor of how I approach things, which is some of these basic principles. Keep your mind open to imagining that they are these functions are being fulfilled by institutions that are unlike the ones that we're comfortable now thinking about. So, and then that will, I think, is a useful tool for asking further questions. Like, as I said, if they're moving money through time or something like this, how do they deal with the risks associated with that? Does a market play a role? From the financial side, I think we've got great potential for collecting data that we can study things, study the development of things, study innovations that happen through time and how problems were solved in different ways by different people. And although I talk a lot about it in the book, I haven't focused on the innovation aspect of this, but what we do see is a number of great ideas like, I don't know, privatizing the entire fisc of France, or creating savings securities in 18th century Holland. That some of them succeeded, some of them failed. Why did they fail? The failures can help us understand what makes a technology work and what makes it fail. So I guess I will leave it at that and open things up for questions from you.
Why don't you just do your applications before you start?
What's that?
The applications.
Oh, okay.
I think we have enough time.
Oh, sure.
Certainly.
Just to go into a little bit more detail about how you might approach these applications in studying the ancient world. The dimension of time has a number of, I would say, examples that, that would not immediately seem to be financial. But I would argue that, that they are, or at least the financial aspect of them might be interesting to you. And I mentioned the contracts before, the Cuneiform Tablets. If those of you that know much about ancient Near East know that a lot of the Cuneiform Tablets that exist are really, I would say, administrative and business documents, some of them being specific contracts about fulfilling future obligations. I've been particularly interested in lately in prestige objects, what you might think about as works of art that have a purpose that is intended to be valued over generations. And we know in the ancient Near East, you'll find things that are out of context. They're like 300 years older than the rest of than the context. And they seem to be precious objects that are kept for either, they might be kept for collecting, but they might be kept as a memento. China is a particularly interesting example of this. In the Shang and the Zhou dynasties in China, the first two Chinese dynasties, the thing that most people recognize from that, the objects, are these beautifully cast bronze cauldrons and pots and with great elaborate decorations. When I was young and learning about these things, everybody said, oh, you got to focus on what the animal motifs are and the decorative features and understand the stylistic evolution. Nobody ever told me to look in the pot, okay? And you look in the pot, and there are several, not all of them, but something like a half of them have an inscription in Chinese. And the inscription is a memorial to some event that had taken place. And those inscriptions are fascinating because they're, for example, one is a record of a sale of land from one family to another, and explaining how much the compensation was. Another is a record of the creation of a work of a creation of the pot itself, of the bronze itself, and how much was paid to the person that cast the bronze, and the payment was made in cowrie shells. So people ask, well, where did money come from? Some people think that early Chinese money was based upon cowrie shells. One form of payment certainly was strings of cowries. Another pot, less clearly financial, was a resolution of a dispute between two branches of a very wealthy family in about 1000 BC in the heartland of China. And it was an agreement that a dispute would be settled by the woman who was the leader of the clan, saying this part of the family got 2/3, that part of the family got 1/3. And they made two pots for the two families, and the two families kept those pots through time, and those were mementos of this contract that were a way to validate or verify or make a firm commitment, temporal commitment to that economic division. So, other examples that are sort of clearly time-related, of course, are hoards, numismatic hoards, coins, where somebody has put the coin put their savings in a pot, buried the pot, and then never come back to reclaim it. And so the intention very clearly is to hand it to their former self, and they never showed up. Now, on the risk, some of my most interesting kind of, some of the things that really interested me the most about the Sumerian documents relating to risk is the emergence of future plans. You know, it's easy to mistake plans for actual things that happen, but the Sumerians and Babylonians, once they sort of figured out what they believed to be the particular path of a planet, or in this case, the rate at which a herd of cattle would multiply, you know, that plan was a way for them to, that structure was a way to plan for a future event. So they created models of the path of the planets in order to predict when, you know, a planet might appear at a certain time. But they also made models of herds of milk cows and imagined how they would multiply from one year to the next over the course of 10 years, and then how much milk you would expect to be able to get from them. And this was a business plan that wasn't just made for fun. It was made, obviously, to be able to allocate resources, to make sure that the people tending the herd were doing their job. It became this idea of planning, looking into the future and developing a mathematical way of forecasting the future. That was a technology that wouldn't have existed to the degree, to the precise extent that it did without financial needs and also the experience that comes with working in this extra dimension, this extra temporal dimension. I think one of the things, oops, let me go back. One of the things that's really important to emphasize is that many of these functions that I'm calling finance were handled by the family unit even before they were handled by government and bureaucracy or by financial markets. So, for example, old age planning, handled by a family unit. Planning for the future in some societies was having a lot of children. Creating an enterprise meant having family members be the people that you worked with because of the kind of cross obligations and trust that might have implied. So you can think of some of these at least as substitutes for the kinds of ways that societies had dealt with time and uncertainty before. You know, particularly in looking at the evolution of finance in China, what you see is a kind of a mixture between these that is different than what we saw in in the West. Okay. I think I'm going to leave it at that. The example I was going to talk a little bit about was something just sort of the ambiguity of what is a bank, but I'll just mention it briefly. We bring so much of our current conceptual understanding to once the term bank is used, but actually when you think about what banks have done in the past, they typically didn't all do the same kind of thing. So I go from Goldman Sachs to the Bank of Pasion in ancient Athens, and you could make a list of what are the functions that each one of these organizations supplied. And there might not be any overlap, even though each one of them might be thought of as a bank. The Bank of Python in Crocodilopolis being one of the most interesting cases, probably served a fair amount of function of government, managing government revenues, if I believe. Instead of thinking about saying, what's a bank, and let me go find one, think about what those functions are, like providing loans, moderating risk, focusing capital for enterprise, or providing intermediary services for liquidity. And then when you start doing that, you'll find that, well, actually through time, religious institutions supplied that. For China, Buddhist institutions were lending institutions. The Templars served a financial purpose throughout Europe. And why would that be? Well, if one of the important things that you have to deal with in finance is trust about some future repayment, if you have some people that have taken a vow of poverty that is institutionally self-reinforcing, those are people that you could trust your money to, right? You know, if somebody is a Buddhist monk that is not going to accumulate their own wealth, or a Knights Templar who is not allowed to accumulate their own wealth, that might be a function that's very useful to, on which to build an institution that we think is like a bank, but is essentially delivering these services that intermediate between the present and the future. So I would say that's an example, kind of a simple example of how to not look for known institutions, but use these principles to look at other institutions that actually supply those functions. So thank you very much for your attention, and welcome to ask questions.